thanks for coming out. I realize it's been a long afternoon, and happy hour is coming up, so I appreciate you toughing it out and coming to listen to us talk about third-party security evaluations using AI. My name is Jacob Ansari. I'm a security governance partner at Block. We're Square and Cash App and Afterpay and a few other things. And before that, I was an assessor for about 20 years, and I had most, if not all, of the assessor credentials. But enough of that. Before we get started, I'm going to give you sort of the quick disclaimer, the easy out, if that's what you're looking for. If all you want to do with AI and third-party security evaluations is do like a basic review of your collection of third-party AOCs, this is actually pretty easy to do. Right? You could build the bones of this thing out of ChatGPT or Gemini or whatever, probably in the amount of time I'm standing here talking to you on stage. And we've actually done this for our organization. We have a similar process that collects AOCs from our third parties and then does some basic evaluation, like is this AOC current or has it expired? What services does it cover? Has this third party used compensating controls or customized approaches to meet any of the requirements in the PCI DSS? And then we can use the outputs from that either for our internal analytics or for follow-up questions or the like. I need to credit my colleague, Rob Gordon, who unfortunately is not here this week, for building this into a good and sustainable program for our company. But we wanted to do more things with AI tools for third-party risk management. Along the way, or maybe even sort of in front of that, we ended up writing a new governance framework for evaluating third parties for our organization. And the particulars of that is a rabbit hole for another day. But one of the relevant points that arose from that is that we really didn't like yes-no questionnaires as our sort of source of information about how to evaluate our third parties. Instead, we're trying to index on this sort of upper right quadrant of what we call like the high-value, high-fidelity controls or information. High value is to say, what are the things that matter to us for this type of third-party provider, right? Does it integrate with our SSO for authentication? Like, yeah, we care kind of a lot about that. So that's a high-value kind of thing. Like, tell us about your risk management policy. You know, we care a little less about that. So that's maybe not the high-value thing we're looking for. So let's focus on the high-value controls. And then high fidelity is where do we have a good deal of assurance about the completeness and the accuracy of those answers, right? Generally, that's not yes-no questionnaires, right? Those are things that we can either verify empirically or that we can get some attestation in a third-party audit report or something like that. So the idea then is to build an AI tool that can consume some of that information, their audit reports, their developer documentation, other things that they provide us, and then tell us about how that information stacks up against our matrix of controls in our framework. Okay, so like any good project, this has to serve a number of different masters. One is the need for sustainable automation, right? Like literally everybody else on Earth, our VenSec process is understaffed and underappreciated and desperately needs good, sustainable automation to make it viable and really accomplish the things we want. Everybody's nodding their head. Yeah, they know how this goes. Further, in the way that we want business processes that don't depend on human variability, which particular person is operating that part of the process that day, how much coffee they've had, et cetera. We don't want a process that's subject to the whims of like the variability in an AI, right? You give an AI chatbot the same prompt 5 different times, you are not going to get the same answer 5 times. And so those variations are things that you want to watch out for. We also need to be able to show our own org, much less other parties, how our process works. So we need a good history of how we got to where we got and why, what decisions we made about a particular third party, and why we did that. And we need to be able to show that not just to like an external auditor or our compliance folks, but like our internal audit team who likes to come around and ask us, hey, how are we doing this? You know, how can you show us that this is working the way we expect it to? And possibly most crucially, we're trying to reduce the cycle time for approvals. right? And one of the things that we really wanted to do was avoid that sort of situation where you get to that information impasse and then somebody's genius idea is to say, oh, let's schedule a call with the vendor, right? And it takes 4 weeks to get on the calendar and 15 people have to be a part of the call and they all have 10 minutes of talking points and it's a 25-minute, scheduled slot, and like no good will come from that. So let's, not do that. Let's not put ourselves in that situation. Okay, I'm going to give a quick word about the tooling that we've used for this. Most of this began life in ChatGPT, but I, after a while, and I'll show you why in a minute, moved to an AI framework called Goose that our organization has published as an open source project. Goose uses other AI models as like the core of it, right? Something from OpenAI or Anthropic or something like that. But it has a lot of extensibility and support for what's called the Model Context Protocol, or MCP. MCP just lets us connect AI tools to resources and data like Google Drive, Slack, Jira, GitHub. You get the idea, right? So I'm not pitching Goose. It's an open source project, and 10% of 0 is still 0. And you could probably get comparable results in other sets of tools. I just wanted to describe what we were using. Okay, so let's look at something for real. And it turns out that chat-based, browser-driven LLMs are a terrible spectator sport, and so you have this like kind of cryptic screen cap here, and so I apologize for it being hard to read. But this is a custom GPT, right? If you've ever played around with ChatGPT's like edit functions, you've probably seen a window that looks like this, where I'm directing the GPT to take some of those inputs, like an audit report or the URL to a third party's developer documents, and then evaluate them against our frameworks, right? Now, you're going to see possibly here, and you're going to capture it as you're taking pictures of the slides, references to what are called the PAL and the DSL frameworks. Those are our internal frameworks that describe our provider assurance requirements and our data sensitivity. The particulars aren't important. In your situation, you're going to use your own requirements, but that's the cryptic 3-letter acronyms there, and that's what they mean. And I've actually attached those documents to this GPT. It's just that the place where you upload files is beneath where the screen cap cuts off. So the point is I've given it the frameworks, and I've given it these directions, and then I'm going to run that GPT using the inputs from a particular provider and have it provide a tabulated output that shows our matrix of controls and how that provider stacks up against them. Okay, so let's take a quick look at the results. And I have like Crayola scribbled out over the provider's name to protect the innocent. But you can see here it's like categorized the controls, and it's given some control names, and it has like a pass or a sort of pass, and then some commentary about that. And it gives these seemingly plausible, seemingly coherent kinds of results, even if it's kind of positively predisposed toward the benefit of the provider, right? You're not seeing it here, but down below, in some of the output, it would give me like a summary of like, here are the couple of things that this provider really needs to do to get over the hump to meet your requirements. Like, it was really rooting for these guys to meet our standards. But when I sort of scratched the surface a little further to basically say, show your work, right? Tell me how you got here. That's when things started to go off the rails. Okay, so I'm not showing you screenshots of like how things went badly, not because I'm ashamed of them. Okay, I'm a little ashamed of them, but I would need like 10 more screen caps to show you kind of how that all worked in like practice, and we just don't have time for that. But I can categorize how things went awry into like a couple of different categories, right? One is the results were variable, right? And this is not surprising, right? You've given AI the same prompt 5 times, you're not going to get the same answer 5 times. But also, like, the output format would vary a little bit. And maybe that doesn't seem like a big deal, but it can adversely impact a downstream workflow, even sort of subtle changes in output. The other thing is that LLMs seem to only handle so many instructions before it starts doing other things. It's a little bit like how I give my kids chores, right? Like, I need you to do these 5 things, all right? Here they are. And then I go away for an hour and I come back and they're like wiped out on the couch, wrapped in blankets, looking like they've run a mile and they've done maybe 2 of the 5 things that I've asked them to do, right? And so some of the things that the AI ignored were sort of extraneous, where I said, give us some good follow-up questions, or compare these results to their industry peers, throwaway stuff. But some was more crucial, right? It would take the table of the controls in our framework and give results for most of them, and just kind of arbitrarily decide where it was going to cut off, and just, I'm done. Or it would take several of our individual controls and kind of muddle them together into a sort of plausible sounding composite. And it actually took me a while, like, wait a minute, I wrote that framework and it's missing things, because it just decided, I'm going to mash these together, right? Now, I could revise the prompt a little bit. I could run it again and say, no, enumerate each individual control exactly as stated and do not vary the language. Sort of like how I can tell my middle schooler, no, when I say do the dishes, I mean empty the dishwasher, and then put the dishes away, and then load the dirty dishes into the dishwasher, and then run the dishwasher, and then clean the things that cannot be dishwashed. I love that boy. But you get what I'm getting at, right? I could tell it to do that, and it worked most of the time, right? But when I started directing the LM to cite its sources, right? Tell me how you determine whether or not a control was met. That's when things got sort of troublesome. It did a really interesting thing where it would take a really brief kind of throwaway line in a SOC 2 audit report about a policy statement. Yeah, we require the use of SSO for authentication. And then it would use that statement as the rationale for a whole bunch of fairly complex SSO controls. Oh yeah, it requires SSO, and it prohibits password-based authentication, and it does SCIM integration, and it allows you to do custom roles. No, I mean, ironically, it was the kind of thing that I would expect a very junior auditor to do, and so in some ways that was the most human-like behavior I'd seen out of some of these things. But more hilariously is when it would just outright fabricate things. Sometimes I would say, okay, well, tell me what SOC 2 control number meets this control that you say is passed, and it would come up with some control that didn't really have anything to do with it. This was particular for things where I did not expect the provider to meet our control, and I certainly didn't expect a SOC 2 report, for example, to describe this sort of thing in detail, right? Do you do field or row level encryption? If you're conversant with what's in a typical SOC 2 audit, it tends not to get that detailed about that sort of thing. And so I expected it to say, nah, I don't know, I can't tell. And instead, it dug really deep, and it would just give me some completely random control number that had nothing to do with data encryption at all, or it would just fabricate a control number that did not exist in the SOC 2 report. Yeah, it's in 6.8.4. There's no 6.8.4. It stops at 6.8.2. And so when I would prompt it again, hey, you made stuff up, it was super apologetic about that, but the damage was done. Okay, so trying to figure out what went wrong, some of the culprits are really obvious. Too many directives per prompt kind of overloads the buffer, so to speak. And that seems like an obvious way for things to go wrong. But it also seems like there are some context collisions that confuse it. So our internal framework has controls, and an audit report has controls. And those are similar, but not actually exactly the same thing. And I think I could get confused on that. Or context collisions occurred in other circumstances. I hate to keep harping on SSO, but it's such a great use case here. When I'm asking about how a third party's SSO works, it's how does your product integrate with our SSO? And most audit reports that talk about SSO are saying their users use their SSO to authenticate to their internal systems. And that's the kind of thing that will confuse some humans. So it's not hard to imagine a context collision like that creating problems for an AI. And there's also, with ChatGPT, and I think maybe you've experienced this if you've used that for other things, there's this intermittent bias away from I don't know. There's this desire it has to tell you what it thinks you want to hear, or some disposition towards that. And so rather than just say, yeah, your inputs didn't really address this content, or didn't really talk about this particular security requirement you've got, it will hallucinate something into existence. It will concoct something rather than just say, sorry, don't know. Okay, so I needed to change tack. This is where I switched from ChatGPT to Goose, mostly for access to our internal resources and data. And then later on, I got some good advice from a colleague to use Google's Notebook LM, which had very, very interesting and very sort of sober analysis, but the output was harder to use. I'll talk about that a little bit more a little later. The other thing we needed to do was to try to decompose like a big request into a series of smaller tasks and then run an AI agent against that like decomposed set of tasks. I also tried to put my finger on the scale a little bit to say, if I expect this particular control to be addressed by an audit report, then tell that agent to look in the audit report. And if I expect this other control to be more probably addressed by like the developer documentation or some other set of inputs, then go look there, but don't cross the streams. Okay, so I switched from using text-dense, hard-to-read, browser-based tooling to text-dense, hard-to-read Markdown output because I'm a genius who loves to destroy my own eyesight. So this is the output from Goose in Markdown, where it's taken that same sort of framework of controls and evaluated the same set of inputs. And again, it's passing this provider on a lot of these controls in ways that at this point sort of strained credulity for me because I'd run the same test cases over and over again and I read those audit reports over and over again, and so I was pretty good at smelling the BS when it was there. So it turns out, it was being very generous about things. It was taking a very, very generous read of the controls in our framework and trying to determine whether or not this provider met those controls. And if you knew me as an assessor, I don't do generous readings of controls. So I had to really run it again. I would prompt it again to say, no, now interpret our framework much more strictly and go look at your previous work and revise it. And the results differed significantly. Like this screen cap here is basically 2 minutes later from the last one, but it's marked a bunch of those controls as not met, right? Like, no, it doesn't explicitly talk about this thing. No, it doesn't address the issue at hand. And so this second pass increased accuracy quite a bit for me, possibly to the detriment of these third parties. But what I wasn't able to do was to essentially bypass this step and say, no, do it right the first time. Like attempting that never quite got me to where I needed to go, right? I always had to run this sort of two-step process. And so I got fewer problematic results or fabrications or things that didn't exist. Not zero, but fewer. Okay, so I'm getting to the end of this, and I need to not spiral off into too many tangents. But here are some of the lessons that I was able to sort of extract from this effort. And we're still working, I guess, is the other point. One is sort of more iterations. Not just take a big task and amortize it into smaller tasks, but take each of those smaller tasks and run a few iterations on each of those smaller tasks. And then you can take those results and smooth them out, right? So in the situation where you ask the LLM the same thing 5 times and you get 5 different answers, but if you average them together, you're less likely to get sort of screwy results from any one particular occurrence. And so we started to work on that with some of our efforts, and that seemed to bear out some promise, although we're still working on it. The other piece of advice I'll give you, because all of my advice, I guess, is parenting advice, but pick your battles. Right? Avoid too many directives. Right? Really, cut out the things that you can live without. Right? Don't give it too much stuff to do because it will wander off at some point. And I would also say be really careful about your prompting choices. Avoid overloaded terms like control if in your context they can have multiple meanings or apply somewhat differently, right? The more times you have to say, no, run it again, but do this, the less sort of repeatable the process is when you have to hand it off to somebody else and they have to do it 50 times a day, right? There are platform trade-offs. NotebookLM was very good at like very sober analysis and did very little hallucination, but it just kind of gives the output in like its browser sort of text box output window, and you have to like manually copy and paste that into something else to really work with it, unless for some inexplicable reason you want it to like give you an AI podcast about its results. I'm not sure why it does that, but it does. And lastly, I would say you want to keep your eye on the ball, right? Stay focused on what's really important. For us, it was about improving a workflow, right? Making life easier for a team that had essentially an impossible set of labor in their process, right? And so how do we make this better? And if I have some genius AI that's perfectly capable of doing like incredible things, but it doesn't work with the process, it doesn't improve the workflow, then it's not that helpful. And lastly, the good advice I'll give anyone, start small, go for easy wins, and iterate carefully. Okay, I'm out of time, but I would love to talk to anybody out in the showcase or anytime here for the rest of the meeting if you want to talk about this some more. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.